Yes, welcome into the camp. Badgers 2-0 for the first time since 2020. They beat South Dakota 27-13. Probably not the overpowering victory and impressive victory that a lot of people were hoping for heading into next week against Alabama, but it is what it is, and we will talk all about it. What went right, what didn't go right. We'll get into your questions as well. We'll look ahead to Alabama probably on Tuesday, though maybe it'll creep into this conversation as well. Before we get to that, though, Home Field is the official apparel sponsor of the camp, the best vintage gear you could possibly find. And they've got a lot of new Wisconsin gear, a couple of T-shirts, a new sweatshirt, a new hoodie, I should say, new hat. Then they have these new sideline jackets, football coaches jackets that they just released I think it was like a week ago, a little bit more than a week ago. All of it is great. All of it's impressive, and I think you guys will like it a lot. Just go take a look if you haven't seen it up on homefield.com and use the promo code Bucky24 for 15% off your first purchase. All right, Jesse, let's get into it. As I said last week, we're going to be positive to start every show. That's what we're going to do. I know that's not everyone's thing, but it's what we're going to do. And I'd like to ask you, what went right in week 2 for the Badgers as they beat South Dakota?
The first quarter and the fourth quarter. The first quarter was exactly what we and a lot of other people had been expecting to see, certainly from the Badgers fan base, hoping to see. And I thought they couldn't have played much better outside of Ches Malusi fumbling the initial carry. Unfortunately for the Badgers, Joe Brunner was able to recover, but they took a 14-0 lead. Tyler Van Dyke was really able to open it up, completed a 32-yard pass, a 22-yard pass, and then the 50-yard touchdown pass to C.J. Williams, which was an absolutely great play call from Phil Longo that the players talked about afterward. And then defensively, doing your job and not allowing South Dakota to get momentum early. We can talk about the middle quarters later. And the fourth quarter, this is a game that could have gone either way. At one point, it was only a 17-13 lead. The defense did its job, forced punts on South Dakota's last 3 possessions. And the offense just absolutely owned the quarter in time of possession. They had the ball for more than 11 and a half minutes or somewhere around 11 and a half minutes and outgained South Dakota 90 plus yards to 7. So if you're looking for encouraging signs, there were more big plays because there really weren't any in week 1. There wasn't any play that went longer than 17 yards. And they had 4 or 5 of those through the air, at least. And just being able to finish games, which is so important for this program. It's something that Luke Fickell talked about repeatedly during his first offseason, finishing games in the fourth quarter. They were not able to do that consistently in year 1. And now they've been able to do that in the first 2 games. So those are a couple positives that come to mind.
Yeah. So you go back and you talk about that first quarter. They had 165 yards in the first quarter. They averaged nearly 10 yards per play. They had 113 yards passing. You mentioned the big plays from, 3 different guys, and I think that is also a positive. It wasn't just like it was Will Pauling doing the damage. It was Bryson Green. It was Vinny Anthony, and then obviously C.J. Williams with that long catch on what was a perfect play call and kind of what they perhaps knew what was coming from South Dakota in that moment, that little RPO that Tyler Van Dyke thought maybe all along, and certainly C.J. Williams thought all along that would end up being a pass. So, yeah, that was fantastic. And then, yeah, in the fourth quarter, after they got that stop in the third quarter when Vinny Anthony fumbled near the goal line and they held South Dakota to 3 points, they essentially dominated the rest of the game, right? Like South Dakota was down 27-13. They punted and they never got the ball back there in the fourth quarter as Wisconsin just ran it, and we got to see the true freshman as well. I think those are certainly a positive as well with Dylan Jones and Darian Dupree. And you go and look it wasn't overwhelming, right? With those two, Dupree 6 for 24 and Dylan Jones 4 for 14, but they both picked up first downs. So that was good. We didn't mention, and I know you probably just don't want to take all the positives, but Cade Yacamell was a huge positive, right? I mean, he had a career high 50 some odd yards like in the first half, and then he finished with 73 yards on just 8 carries. He had 2. What is considered an explosive run in 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 rushing? Is it 12 yards? Is it 15 yards? Either way, he had a couple of explosive runs, I thought, including that 29-yarder. So he was certainly, I think, a significant positive. Defensively, Tackett Curtis. Obviously, losing Jake Chaney the way that they did in the third quarter on that targeting call, which, again, we can talk about. But he stepped up. And I think he ended up with 5 tackles, and 3 of them were solo tackles, and he played a role in one of the plays that they dropped South Dakota for a loss. So those are, I think, individual positives were there for sure. And I thought, for the most part, Tyler Van Dyke was solid. I think there's probably a couple throws he would want back. There was a throw on a third down to the tight end that should have been a first. Yeah, that should have been a first down that he just missed on. And then the first flea flicker, he had CJ Williams open. He said that it was a little late for him. He didn't see it early enough. And then when it came off his hand, it kind of came off his hand on the right side. And I thought it looked like it slipped out of his hand. He said it didn't, but it just kind of floated on him, because that probably should have been a touchdown if he had seen it right away and then also thrown it the way that we know he can throw it. It didn't necessarily come off his hand very well. So I think that there were some team positives and there were some certainly individual positives as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Cade, because he certainly warrants discussion here early. Luke said on Monday that Cade obviously had done everything right in the offseason. They were very impressed with him, and he was going to get a lot more opportunities. He just didn't necessarily know where those opportunities were going to come or what it would look like. And Tui Walker did not play. He got dinged up early in the season opener against Western Michigan, spent some time in the tent on the sideline, but ended up coming back and playing. And he was listed as questionable for week 2. They held him out. And so that elevated Cade into the number 2 running back spot, and he took advantage of it. It surpassed his career high of, I think it was 48 yards rushing was the previous high by the second quarter, and gave them something a little bit more dynamic, which they desperately need in the run game. Ches has run his butt off here through a couple of weeks and had 2 big touchdowns. I think he's averaging fewer than 4 yards per carry so far. And it's still a small sample size, but if you're looking for some big hitting plays, Cade gave that to them. So I think that's certainly notable. And the Tackett Curtis thing, as you mentioned, a long road back for him. Started 8 games at USC a year ago, ended up transferring and could not participate while he was recovering from an offseason surgery. We saw him for 1 practice in the spring. And even when preseason camp broke, I really wondered what his role was. I just didn't necessarily know. It was fair to say you had Jaheim Thomas, Jake Chaney, Christian Allegro, and then Curtis, and he made the most of his opportunity after Chaney went out. So there were plenty of positives, but enough things to work on, flaws, if you want to call them, that there's a lot to be desired.
We'll get there in a second. Before we do, though, when I was putting together my post-game stuff, I usually put a play of the game in my write-up, and I don't know that there was necessarily a play of the game, but I thought there was a sequence of the game that was also a positive after Vinny Anthony's fumble, because they were backed up. It was 1st and goal, and they get stops on the first 2 plays, but then Chaney's called for the targeting, so it gives them 1st and goal at the 4, and they just went backwards. You know what I mean? They had a tackle for loss, and then Elijah Hills came through and got the sack, and he's another positive. We have talked about trying to find some people that could create pass rush from the defensive line, especially with James Thompson Jr. out. And while it hasn't necessarily been consistent by any stretch, Elijah Hills does have 2 sacks now in 2 games. So I think that certainly speaks to him doing what he can do. And that was a very important sequence in the game where they were able to hold South Dakota to a field goal. And that was the last time that they really even challenged scoring. So it was, I think individually, I think he certainly stood out as well. Trying to see what else we got here.
Well, you're right. The defense did provide more pressure, which was another thing that I felt was important for this team to show. Hills had the sack in the opener. That was the only sack in TFL that Wisconsin had. And in this game, they were able to tally 6 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, had a couple guys combine on a sack. And so no game is going to be perfect, but there were steps forward in key areas, especially defensively, that I think were encouraging.
Special teams, another outside of the Vinny Anthony fumble, the 2 kickers. I think Atticus Berchams has had a very nice start to the season, especially after what we saw last year. Had a 53-yarder, and then also had another that he dropped inside the It was inside the 15. I mean, it would have been an even better punt if it had been down, but he dropped it inside the 10, and then it kind of bounced out a little bit. But that would have been another one that was over 50 yards. So he has looked certainly improved from last year. And Nathaniel Vakos goes, 2 for 2 on the night or on the day, including that 50-yarder that looked closer to a 51-yarder, but whatever. And he's now 4 for 5 on the season. I think both of those guys have played well outside of that missed field goal from Vakos in the first game.
Yes, absolutely. And being able to hit 50+ yarders, I think, is critical. How many situations have we seen and did we see last year where you get to about that 33-yard line and you're trying to figure out what to do? If you have a kicker that you feel like can be automatic, that can make all the difference in the world. I think Bertram's is significantly improved in terms of consistency. And we saw that in the preseason. They felt really good about that. And he talked about it too, that he had a conversation with Fickle after the season, and just year one did not meet his standard, anybody's standard. So he's been much better, and the ability to flip the field, again, significant. We don't always talk about special teams because we're focused on offense and defense, but you're right. They've made steps forward in those areas.
2 more team positives before we get into the what didn't go right for Wisconsin, and that would be third down. They went 7 for 14 on third down. That's obviously 50%, and they're now 17 for 30 on third down this season. They were actually pretty good on third down, at least in Big Ten play last year. The area where they were not very good last year was fourth down. They went 5 for 20 on the year. They're now 2 for 2 this season, including Ches Malusi scoring from 1 yard out late. And that, I mean, again, it was a 20-13 game. If he doesn't get it, you give South Dakota the ball back and then allow them a chance to go and tie the game. And instead, Ches Malusi obviously gets in there, and essentially that was the dagger in the game. So positives. Those are the positives. We made it 13 minutes in here, Jesse, with positives. I think that's very impressive on our part. Now, is there anything else you want to hit on before we move on?
Well, I think Luke discussed that 4th and goal effort, and I thought that was noteworthy because he said, if I'm going to spend this entire offseason talking about we want to put it on our offensive line, we want to be physical, and then you don't go out and do it at a critical moment, what does that say? So yeah, maybe it's a small moment or a moment that you expect Wisconsin to be able to accomplish, but that was a notable moment in the game for Wisconsin to be able to really seal the deal.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on. What went wrong in Wisconsin's 27-13 win over South Dakota? I'll allow you to start.
Well, it's the middle quarters. If you're going to take a commanding first quarter lead like that, you want to be able to maintain that. I mean, the fact that it's 17-13 and South Dakota has the ball with an opportunity to take the lead, that's just not great. I don't know how else to put it. I know that South Dakota is a really good FCS team. They came into that game ranked 6th in the country in the FCS. They won 10 games a year ago, went to the quarterfinal of the playoffs, won their first game by 6 touchdowns. But if you're going into Alabama week, you want to be able to show people why they should believe you have a chance. And it just wasn't good enough in the middle quarters. It wasn't consistent enough. Defensively, the drive that stands out most is the 4-play 75-yard drive where South Dakota didn't even have to pass the ball. They just ran it right down Wisconsin's throat. It ended up with a 35-yard touchdown run where they cut across the field and just kind of outran the defense. Wisconsin got beaten up front. I don't know what to say. That's just not good enough. And of course, Vinny Anthony knows you can't fumble a punt return inside the 10. So you're in a situation where it's a 4-point game. It's a little, I think, disconcerting that you've played 2 teams so far that are viewed as not being on the same level of a Big Ten program, even if South Dakota is good. And you've been in the 4th quarter of games that are in doubt. That are 1-possession games that you're losing in week 1 against Western Michigan. So those are a few things that come to mind.
I don't know if I've maybe harped on it enough or said it enough, but I've certainly felt it enough. And that is, the run defense was a concern last year. It was a concern coming into this season, and it remains very much the case. I mean, South Dakota, while the raw numbers are not like they don't hit you over the head a little bit, but when you take a deeper look into them and you take away the sacks and you take away the kneel down, they average nearly 6 yards a carry. And that first drive coming out of the half was just, I mean, how does that happen? How does 4 straight plays like that? And a lot of it, I mean, it was poor tackling. It was also over pursuing and allowing a lot of cutback. I mean, the cutback lanes were huge, especially um, on, I think it was the second run. But I just don't know how Wisconsin can consistently compete in games if they're not going to stop the run. And I know that some people are like, well, maybe throw different inside linebackers in there. Use Christian Allegro more. Obviously, you're going to see Taka Curtis more. I Sometimes it's just you have to be able to play fundamental sound football, and they just have not done that in the run game enough so far this year.
I
And
think
I don't know what I mean. I don't know I just don't know.
I don't either. It's so strange because Wisconsin is 2-0. That hasn't happened in 4 seasons. But the reason the Badgers are 2-0 is because they have not played a power conference opponent. The reason they were 1-1 the last 3 years is because they played power conference opponents. And yes, Washington State at the time was a power conference opponent. Also, obviously, lost in 2021 to Penn State. And so these guys want to talk afterward about how we've handled adversity and how we've shown that we can win games late. And I just question what exactly that's great for this team to be 2-0, to be in the position that they're in going into Alabama week. But what exactly does that mean that you have been able to handle adversity against Western Michigan and South Dakota when you're talking about the rest of this schedule? I don't know how you can feel particularly good about what the rest of this season looks like. Now it's very possible that they just, however you want to phrase it, ironing out the kinks, haven't been sharp, working their way toward being their best version, all that stuff. But all we have to go on are the first 2 games, and it's just hard to look at what remains and think that this is going to be good enough.
Yeah, again, when we talked about the first week and we were looking for improvement off the first week, I think that they did improve in some of the areas that we were asking about, right? The big plays, they didn't turn the ball over on offense. They were a little bit better in the red zone, though. Again, they had to settle for a field goal there near the end of the first or in the middle of the second quarter. They couldn't finish that one off. There were some improvements, but again, I come back to the idea: if you can't stop the run, there's just no way you're going to win at a high level against the teams that are going to come in here and pound it down your throat. I was shocked that South Dakota didn't try and run the ball more. It made no sense to me, especially in the red zone. Just run the ball, prove Wisconsin and make Wisconsin prove that they can stop you. And I don't know that they necessarily did that. And I don't think Alabama's going to stop running the ball if they're running it the way that South Dakota did in stretches, coming up on Saturday. So that was certainly, obviously, something that stood out. I think another thing that stood out certainly was some of the injuries that popped up, and they're Nazir Forkring gets dinged up. They put Xavier Lucas in. Then he gets hurt. He goes down. We saw Bryson Green get dinged up, come back. Riley Nowakowski got dinged up, but came back. There are a number of guys that are dinged up coming into this game, and then you lose Jake Chaney. And I know that some are like, well, Jake Chaney hasn't even played well anymore or hasn't played well this year. Who cares? Taka Curtis is going to be there. Jake Chaney's an important piece of this team, especially leadership-wise. He's not going to be on the field for the first half. The targeting thing, I think, is something that is at least worth talking about because Luke Fickell's not happy about it. And, it would be one thing if he would just said he's upset with Jake Chaney being thrown out, but he was upset with the Western Michigan guy getting thrown out last week. He was upset with the South Dakota guy getting thrown out, even though if between the 2 hits on Saturday, I would certainly say the South Dakota hit was much closer to targeting and deserving of a penalty more so than Jake Chaney putting his helmet into the midsection. But again, see what you hit. Keep your head up. See what you hit. And Jake Chaney did not do that. And that's why, obviously, he got ejected. But he's like, we've told them, and they just don't listen in terms of the NCAA or the people that are making the rules, the rules committees. They just don't listen. I'm not a fan of kicking guys out unless it's malicious, and I don't think either of those hits yesterday were malicious whatsoever.
I couldn't agree more with Luke. I think it's absolutely absurd that this rule is in place the way that it is. I am completely on the side of player safety and understand that you want to eradicate those kinds of hits. We're going to have this conversation every season. We have had this conversation every season because it's not going away. There are other ways to handle this. And sometimes it can be difficult to determine intent. At the same time, this game moves so fast and it's a matter of 1 inch. And you can start your movement one place and it ends up in another place. I've heard people talk about what if they do something similar to soccer where you have that kind of yellow card, red card situation. Okay, you get a warning. The 15-yard penalty in itself is detrimental and enough to make players not want to commit this type of infraction, throwing them out of a game. And it's even worse when it's in the second half because you got to spend the entire week understanding you're not going to play in the first half of the next game. And Luke talked about this. You only have 12 opportunities during the regular season. It's absolutely absurd, and they need to do something different. You can still maintain the integrity of what this rule is about without punishing these guys in a punitive way. Like, it is just nonsensical to me, to be honest.
Yeah. So there, fans had some other negatives. We'll obviously get those in our in our Twitter questions. So we'll start with that right now. And this one was not a negative. It was A Fleshy saying, "Is Cade Yacamell Wisconsin's best running back?"
I don't think so.
Has he performed the best so far?
100%. I don't know how you can deny that. Tawee Walker wasn't able to play in week 2 and was hampered in week 1, so I don't know that we've necessarily seen his full capabilities. I think while Ches has run hard, has 3 touchdown runs at this point, has not had a ton of explosives, and Cade is the only one who's been able to provide that. Yeah, these are different kinds of questions. He's clearly been the most productive, and when you are consistently productive, you're going to get more opportunities. Hey, I'd like to see more of those freshman guys, but they're still early in their career. So, Cade is at a point in his career where he is above those 2 guys. I think the ceiling clearly is higher for those 2 freshmen. I don't know that he's the best running back, but you could say he's the best running back for the team in the moment right now because that's how the coaching staff is planning.
Nate says, anyone that plays college football 25 knows Yacamell has the juice. Is it too crowded in the backfield right now? And I will just say, I think Cade is fine on college football 25, but, Nate White's where it's at. So, sorry, go ahead.
Who you moved to slot receiver because you had a crystal ball and saw the future.
He's still running back, but he got moved. He just plays a ton in the slot because that's just, that's where the ball's going a lot because I love this. I love slot receivers almost as much as I love my family.
Look, you can't argue with what Cade has done through 2 games.
That's a Phil Longo. That's a Phil Longoism.
So he's been everything they've needed so far. I'll be really interested to see what happens when Tawee is healthy. Like there's not enough carries, I don't think, to have 3 guys getting a ton of opportunities. Maybe that means Cade gets 4 or 5 carries. He got the carries late in week 1. And at the same time, you want to keep those freshmen interested, or I don't know the best way to put it, but we want to make sure they get their opportunities too. So depth is not a problem, but you got to figure out how to use those guys.
I guess this is another question, and maybe you've already answered it, but Aaron says, should the freshman running back start soon? Honestly, they looked much more decisive.
I think that'd be a hard message to deliver to your team, to be like, you're leapfrogging all these other guys. And unless, there's stuff they're doing, they're getting a ton of opportunities in practice. That's a delicate balance to strike because, like I said, I think the ceiling on those 2 guys is as high as anybody in that room. So I don't anticipate we'll see them in a starting role in the near future, given the depth, but I do want to see more of them.
Jeff asks, is Elijah Hills the best positive surprise of the season so far?
Maybe. Yeah. I think that's a reasonable take just because we had so many questions about the D-line. We still do. At a certain point in spring ball, he was running with the 3s because TJ Bowlers was still here. And I didn't know if he was going to have a role. And by the end, he had worked his way into the 2 deep. And now with James Thompson Jr. out, he's getting more opportunities. I think it's always a crapshoot with the transfer portal and even more so with FCS guys, just because you don't necessarily know whether it's going to translate the success they had at a lower level. And so for him to have 2 sacks through 2 games, I would not have necessarily predicted that, but it's been great for him and for the Badgers.
All right. So there are several questions about the rush defense. The only reason I'm bringing it up again is because I broke down, because someone was asking about when they have 3 defensive linemen out there, why don't they do that more often? But here are the questions. Hurd says, is this rush defense equipped to handle Big Ten play? Alabama seems like a stretch. Kyle says, feels like they do a better job stopping the run when there are 3 defensive linemen out there. Why don't they do that more? And Chris says, if all remaining opponents fail to throw a single pass, how many more wins does Bucky get? Answer that third one the first.
If every team only runs
Never.
the ball,
Yep. If they don't throw a single pass.
I
It's
feel like
unfair.
I feel like
It's a
the
little
odds
unfair.
are in Wisconsin's favor because it would be entirely one-dimensional. But I understand where that question is coming from. I don't know. That's a
Yeah.
tough one. What say you on that one?
I mean, if they tell Wisconsin they're gonna run it, I think it'll be fine. But I don't think that they would tell them either way. I wanted to talk about the 3 down lineman one because I think that there's a lot of people that have seen Mike Tressel's defense and how much 2 defensive linemen they play. I don't know that it's any more than it was before. Like Jim Leonard, the base defense for almost every Wisconsin defense for the last decade plus has been 2 defensive linemen because they play the nickel as much as they do. So they just haven't played the run very well with the guys that they have. I think that's more so the thing than the actual formation. But they asked, do they play the run better when there's 3 defensive linemen on the field? Absolutely. Absolutely. They if you take sacks out of it, Wisconsin had, or I should say, overall plays, 14 plays with 3 defensive linemen, 5 were passes, 9 were runs. Those 9 runs went for 30 yards. On the 15 runs with 2 or fewer defensive linemen on the field, 119 yards, so and 8 yards per carry. So yes, they obviously stopped the run better with 3 defensive linemen on the field. The problem is personnel on the other side. You have to match personnel. And when it's a lot of 11 personnel on the other side or 10 personnel, then you have to match that personnel. And you can't have 3 defensive linemen on the field. That said, I'm a little curious as to why they haven't done more of the, I guess maybe we'll see. Maybe they'll break it out against another team, but more 3-3-5, where you still have the ability to play defense. You still have nickel in, but you have a little bit more depth up front. But that would be my only question. And just the 3 defensive linemen on the field is at least in how they've used it, is more related to the personnel on the other side than it is their own choice.
It's a question I'd certainly like to be able to ask Mike Tressel because I know he would give a thoughtful explanation since it's his defense. Felt like at Cincinnati, they played a lot more of that 3-3-5 type. And you're right. If the other team is lining up with 4 wide receivers or 3 wide receivers, you've got to be able to combat that. We even saw situations against South Dakota where they had 6 defensive backs on the field, which was a new little wrinkle. They put Nizer Forkurine in the slot because they had Xavier Lucas out there with Ricardo Hallman, which I thought was interesting. But it's a hard one to answer unless we can ask Mike Tressel, because it's a question of why is Wisconsin doing what it's doing, and he's the one calling the plays.
If I'm being honest, I think it's an okay question for Luke Fickell too, just because he is a defensive guy. So I think that's probably a worthwhile question for Monday. But going back to the original question, is this rush defense equipped to handle Big Ten play? What I've seen so far through 2 games, no.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. You wanted to get to this point and feel like some of the deficiencies were shored up to the point that you knew you'd be able to be consistent, and they just haven't been. I mean, it's only going to get harder from here, obviously.
Badger Beatdown asks, Christian Allegro and Taka Curtis seem to bring a different type of juice at inside linebacker. Should they both be starting over Chaney and Thomas? Is that an overreaction or no?
That's tough. I think you could start any of those 4 guys, which is at least a positive for the linebacker group, but I don't necessarily expect to see that unless Allegro or Curtis are just monsters. I mean, Curtis keeps doing what he did. It's hard to keep him off the field. The Jaheim Thomas thing is interesting because this staff has such a history with him all those years at Cincinnati. Then he goes to Arkansas and he's a tackle machine, and he can do some things that make him versatile, like when they put Daryl Peterson down there with his hand on the ground and they have him coming off the edge. You could start any of those guys, but I don't necessarily know that we're going to see a change, except for next week because Chaney will be out for the first half.
Right. So I think with Allegro, he just flashed when he was in yesterday. Like he was in on a tackle for loss, and then he had the sack where he came unblocked. Like no one even blocked him. Those things stand out. I think certainly to my eye, and then obviously to fans' eyes. I don't know if you're going to play him, 40 plays, whether it'll look exactly the same or if there will be some issues otherwise. But I think that there has to be at least a little thought to working some of those other guys in there more. And we'll get to see Tack Curtis, obviously, but I think that there should be at least a little thought considering what's happened to this point. But again, if I'm sitting here and saying, why are they able to run the ball or why haven't they been able to stop the run? I'm not going to be able to break that down myself and tell you, oh, it's the defensive line, it's the linebackers, it's the safeties. I think there are a lot of things that go into it. But I don't think just switching out guys is the answer. I'm not saying it's not the answer, but I don't know if you're just going, oh yeah, throw them in there. They're going to be all good. And they're all of a sudden you're going to be back to the defense that didn't allow people to run the ball whatsoever a couple of years ago. So, Richard says, what's your opinion on Vinny Anthony as a punt returner? Give him a grade so far.
Well, this is coming off a game where he lost a fumble inside the 10.
Which I think is the reason why the question was asked.
So I would not put it particularly high. But the staff felt that he was clearly the top guy. I mean, Tretch feels like he's got more explosive playability just based on what we've seen. And one of the rationales for going with a guy like Anthony is sure hands, but it's hard to make that argument after losing a fumble.
Yeah, again, I know they don't want to put certain guys back there for various reasons, but the most important thing, and I've always been told this ever since I started covering football by Bill Bush, I believe, who was the special teams coach. No, who was the special teams coach under Gary Anderson? Was it Bill Bush? Was he played a role in it, whatever. The only thing that's important on a punt return, or any return for that matter, is that you end up with the ball at the end of it. And Vinny Anthony did not do that. And so that could have been a huge problem for Wisconsin, just like the Tretch fumble on the kickoff last week. Like those could have been just absolutely massive plays if Wisconsin hadn't got him. The Ches Malusi fumble on the first drive of the game could have been massive. Instead, Joe Brunner gets on top of it, and Wisconsin's able to go down and score. Like they lucked out a couple of times. These first couple of weeks, and who knows if games look different if they don't. But Alex says, is a win a win, or should I be worried? And Spencer says, should we be worried about this team, or has this just been some early season lesser opponents and looking ahead?
I think we've hit on this a couple of times. I said this before the season. I'm pretty sure I said it after week 1. I felt like it was important the way Wisconsin won. The way they win matters. And maybe it's not fair. It's a different scheme. It's a different era. But remember when we would watch these Wisconsin teams roll through opponents like this, where it was never close and they established their dominance early. And maybe I'm not giving enough credit to like a South Dakota. They're going to have a very good season in the FCS. That it seems like a reasonable assumption. On the other hand, it's just hard to feel really good about where this team is headed based on the way they have won those games. Yes, credit is deserved for being able to finish in the fourth quarter, but I'd ask, should you be in that position in the first place in these kinds of games? So it's tough because there are fan bases that are unhappy with their program at this point all over the place. And there are fan bases who root for teams that have lost games, maybe even similar types of games. But if the discussion is about taking this program to whatever that next step is, I don't feel like we've seen enough through 2 games to think that that is going to happen right now.
Yeah, I mean, Penn State needed everything it possibly could to get past Bowling Green yesterday. You had Oklahoma State needing to come back to beat Arkansas. You had Kansas State needed to come back to beat Tulane. And I know these teams are not on the same level of what Wisconsin necessarily played, but there were some less than impressive games, and they came out on top. But Iowa, they're no longer undefeated. Their offense that apparently showed up in the second half did not show up against Iowa State, and they lose late in that game. And there have been a lot of underwhelming performances from teams this year. you could make the case that Oregon again. I mean, I don't know how good Boise State is. Maybe Boise State's pretty good. I don't know. Based on their first week, I don't think they are. But Oregon has struggled mightily these first couple of weeks, and they thought they were going to be the best team, one of the best teams in the Big Ten, and they haven't shown that so far. So I think a lot of people are hoping, and I think Wisconsin fans should have that little hope, or maybe that little guy in the back of their head saying everything's fine. They're going to be okay. This is all going to get turned around. But the more we see from this team, and the more the evidence piles up that maybe it's going to be another one of those years, it's tough to overlook. And I guess that's kind of where my mind is starting to go at this point. And this week is going to be massive, I think, in terms of whether you still start thinking that that's going to be the case, or if they put up a fight. If they put up a fight and they're in this game, then maybe it's a little bit different. But Alabama, yes, they won 42-16. That game was not 42-16 to start the fourth quarter. They were on the ropes, and then they went and did Alabama things, scoring 28 points in the fourth quarter. So against South Florida, it's not always perfect early in the year, and certainly Wisconsin has not been anywhere close to perfect. But Badger says, does Northern Illinois beating Notre Dame make you feel better about a potential for next week?
I don't know if those two are related. I mean, credit to Thomas Hammock and NIU for beating Notre Dame, but that has nothing to do with Wisconsin, Alabama. If anything, I think the fact that South Florida had trimmed Alabama's lead to 14-13, and it was 21-16 in the fourth quarter, is something you would want to look at and say, well, what did they do, and how could Wisconsin potentially replicate it before Alabama had the 4 touchdowns or the last 3 to blow the game open. Yes, this is college football. Anything is possible. And I mean, look, this game, we can get into this more on Tuesday, has the potential to be the most significant non-conference home game Wisconsin has ever played. I don't think that's hyperbole, but they got to go and home game. They got to go and do it.
I just feel like I heard something about that somewhere. I couldn't remember where. Did you? Someone else was talking about that yesterday, like how it could have been, such a huge game. I don't remember. I'm sure someone will write about it, but Bill says you've watched 15 Phil Longo coach games in Wisconsin. Do you think his reputation should be attributed to luck because he had plus personnel elsewhere and he's actually just a mediocre coach? And this also goes to Jay Graff. He says, is it time to start the hot seat conversation for both coordinators?
No and no. I mean, we're 2 games into year 2. If they go 5-7 or 6-6 or something, and it's not markedly improved, and I think you can start to at least have those conversations. I don't think that's a fair representation of Longo's career and what he's done. Obviously, he's had great players, but you create your own luck. And you know why he had some of those great players? Because he was able to find them and bring them to a program at like North Carolina and things like that. A lot of this, it comes down to the personnel too. And that's on the staff, no doubt about it as well. But like, I'm not going to sit here and say it's due to luck or having just plus personnel. He's pulling the strings on it. So yes, I thought it would be much more advanced at this point. I thought it was going to be in year 1, but I'm not ready to pull the plug on it or say that 15 games is indicative of his entire career.
I mean, Sam Howell and Drake May.
That helps.
When you're talking about plus personnel, let's say what it is. It's the quarterbacks, yeah. And North Carolina had some very, very skilled, good skill guys too. The 2 running backs that ended up getting drafted. Josh Downs, who was fantastic and is going to be a feature part of Indianapolis's offense. Those are certainly the things. But look, we want to see improvement, and we've seen improvement a little bit in spots, but I don't know that they've been extremely better. They've certainly been better in extended drives. They had 2 more double-digit drives yesterday. Scored on the first one, didn't score on the second. That's because they ran the ball, or it's just they were running the clock out, or I think they obviously would have scored there. But those were things that they were not doing last year. But you'd also don't always want that because you want some explosive plays, and they got those yesterday, especially early on. But CT Badger kind of follows up on this. Is it time to start to question the staff? With inarguably better talent than both of their opponents, they've barely scraped by with little improvement over 2023. Offense barely adequate so far against two immobile quarterbacks with no passing threat. They still get run on. Scary.
I mean, that's what we've been doing here for 2 games is questioning, not necessarily like coaching decisions or anything like that, but what we've seen on the field. So, yeah, there's reason for trepidation. And like I said, it's not going to get any easier. Neither of those 2 teams had any semblance of a downfield passing threat. And now they're going to play a team that has this 17-year-old freshman phenom who's got over 200 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns, and Jalen Milroe, who's a Heisman Trophy candidate with 5 touchdowns, no picks, 4 rushing touchdowns. So, like, this is one of the games where you really find out what the program is made of. On the other hand, like, I don't know, man. I don't know that this is even the game that is the true measuring stick for Wisconsin, because they're just not on that level right now.
Do you want one more of these? Do you think a Leonard Lewis led coaching staff would be in a similar position at this point from Butterbilt?
I think anybody who took over this program was going to have significant headway to make. It's a fun hypothetical, I suppose, but it calls into question all sorts of things. You would have had an entirely different approach to the transfer portal, or the relationships you have, or the people you bring in, or the scheme you run. Very clearly, by the point where they made the decision to move on to a new coach, this program was not where it was, 3-4 years earlier, and it was going to take some time no matter who was there. So I get the question, and it's maybe fun to entertain, but I can't imagine anybody being able to turn this around immediately based on where things were headed.
Last one. Josh says, I think we can all agree this team is severely lacking the it factor required to get to the playoff, or just required to win a lot of games. That was my edit. What do you think is most sorely missing? Is it team chemistry, coaching, scheme, individual player talent, all or none of the above?
Is it fair to say individual player talent?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Look at the guys they had in the years where they were really good. I mean, Jonathan Taylor was a 2-time Doak Walker Award winner. Last decade, they had 3 or 4 of those guys, and they don't have that right now. And I'm glad that last question's in there, because one thing I've thought about is, it's not very scientific, but does this team pass the eye test? And and right now they don't. And I don't know how many of those guys you can say are, the best guy on the field, or the kind of threat that can change something in one play. And so that's kind of where my mind goes, at least initially, when I hear the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that. There are a lot of things missing, I think. I don't think it's just one thing. And
yes,
team chemistry is not. I don't think that is necessarily a big issue at this point. If they start losing games, I think that'll be tested. But right now, I don't know that that's a huge thing. I think individual player talent certainly stands out. Coaching is a part of it as well. Let's just be fair. I mean, they do have some talent, though, because you go and look at recruiting talent, paper talent. Because when you go and look at like the overall talent of a team, and they add up all the recruiting rankings, whatever, and I think they're a top 30 talent-wise team, right? Like top 35, maybe. That 24/7 does it. Maybe On3 does it. But they have, recruiting-wise, they have some talent that's significantly more talent than the 2 teams that they played. And outside of the fourth, and if not for a strong fourth quarter, they could have lost both games. So that individual player talent is there, at least on paper. There's just some things that have to go better. Stop the run and be consistent throughout all 4 quarters, and maybe try and put together the same type of offensive performance you had in the first quarter, and then you have a really good shot on Saturday. But we'll talk more about that Saturday game. That's going to be an intriguing one. I know we'll have plenty to talk about throughout the week as we get ready for the Alabama Crimson Tide coming to town. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.